Right. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome you to the doctoral research clinic session for today, where we are looking at a holistic doctoral training framework that ensures that we develop our students with advanced research competencies, leadership capabilities, and problem-solving skills. And so the session is starting now. And it's my privilege and honor this morning to introduce and welcome Professor Reddy, who is going to introduce our facilitator for today. Professor Reddy, if you are ready, we can get started. I hand it over to you to introduce our facilitator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure being here this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, a literature review in doctoral research is a critical and comprehensive examination of existing scholarly work undertaken in a particular field or focus area. Consequently, it seeks to provide a firm foundation and a basis for original and new research on the thesis. Now, this workshop will explore the meaning and purpose of a literature review as an activity integral to the academic journey as a whole. It will also inter alia highlight the types of literature that could be utilized in such a review, how to secure such literature using online research databases and operators, and provide the requisite guidance on how to construct a critical and engaging literature review. Now, our facilitator for this workshop is Dr. Nikita Singh, who is attached to the Graduate School of Business and Leadership at the University of KwaZulu-Natal as a part-time faculty and furthermore as a senior research fellow. Dr. Singh has facilitated research methodology workshops at the GSBL, Rhodes University Business School, Vega School of Design, and the University of Witwatersrand Center for Local Economic Development. Ladies and gentlemen, over to Nikita Singh, and I'm looking forward to this session because normally I enjoy doing my literature review. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Prof. Kabanda and Prof. Reddy. And good morning, everybody. As Prof. Reddy said, today we're going to delve into the literature review, how to do it, and the mechanisms that entail a successful completion of your literature review chapter. So on that note, I'm just going to start sharing my presentation very quickly. Okay. As I said, everybody, welcome to the Doctoral Research Clinic workshop on literature review and navigation. I am Dr. N. Singh, and if you need my email, it's right at the bottom there. Today's session is planned to be about 3 hours, so let us begin. So in terms of my presentation, there's a lot to cover in terms of the literature review and how to do this chapter. So I'm going to start around the theory and its purpose, because in order to do a literature review, you need to know what its purpose is and how it fits into the overall dissertation. So I'll cover things here like what is a literature review at its basics, when would a literature review be necessary, because we tend to think of, the literature review just existing as sort of your chapter 2 in your dissertation. But when I touch upon this point, you'll see that the act of reviewing literature and writing it up is actually evident in various parts of the dissertation, as well as before and after your dissertation as well. So I'll go into a brief explanation of, how do we do this thing of reviewing literature and writing it up, and look at some of the factors sort of influencing how your particular literature review will look. And then we'll touch on, what is the purpose of this thing called the literature review and what should it aim to accomplish in your overall dissertation. Then we move on to what I call the practice or the technical considerations in writing up your literature review chapters. So these are things like, how do you find literature? How do you find academic literature? How do you sort academic literature? Uh, how do you search properly using database searches and things that you may know of or may not know of, called limiters and Boolean operators? And these are tools to help you sort of refine how you look for information so that you're not overwhelmed with the amount of information out there, which it can be very easy to get overwhelmed because there's a lot of information out there on whatever topic you're looking at. And then I'll delve into search alerts, which is this tool to just remind you about, current and topical literature that is coming, that is being published as you engage through your dissertation process. And I'll look at the actual process or technical considerations involved in actually writing up the literature review. So this section of the presentation is going to be very practical, looking at practical steps on how to find, use, and write up literature. And then I'll conclude the presentation by looking at some of the things that I've picked up over the years in terms of, you could call them tips or tricks, or even advice around, writing up your literature review, around finding information, putting it down, and the most important thing as a doctoral candidate in terms of developing a critical voice and making a contribution where, whether it's an examiner or a person who's reading your dissertation can look at it and say, okay, this was a strong critical piece of work and contributed to the dissertation in a very strong fashion. So as you can see, there's quite a lot to cover in terms of whether you're thinking of it as your chapter 2, your literature review, or just the process of finding information for your dissertation. Okay, so let's start with the basics. And I know as doctoral candidates, probably most of you have an idea in terms of what a literature review is, but let's go into a bit of detail in terms of, at a basic theoretical level, what is it and what should it aim to do in the context of your dissertation? So reviewing the literature is about diving into existing information or literature on an area or phenomenon. So throughout the presentation, I may speak of information, I may speak about literature, I may even speak about content, but it really is about looking at what is available out there in terms of understanding the particular area or phenomenon you've chosen to sort of base your research on. And it's an interpretation and synthesis of published research. So you're going to go into the vast domain of academic research, and you're going to have to develop tools and ways of looking at this research, honing in on things that are relevant to your particular topic, and then interpreting and synthesizing this in such a way that it makes a strong contribution in your study and to your overall dissertation. So that's a big ask because it entails a lot of different components. As you saw from the outline of my presentation, it's not just about understanding what a literature review is before you begin your research, but it's also about opening yourself to developing ways to be able to source the most relevant and academic research for your dissertation, understanding it, analyzing it, and eventually writing it up in a way that makes a strong contribution and is not just a simple sort of rehashing of what other researchers or scholars or academics have said. So it's a big ask. And then there's this component of a literature review as being the part that links the problem being research or your study problem to existing research or knowledge. So it's a way of very strongly justifying what you're doing in your study, because remember, you have to use what's out there as the foundation of justifying as to why you're doing a particular research topic. You have to make a strong argument based on other authors' arguments as to why this is a novel area to research, especially as doctoral candidates. There's that all powerful tagline of you have to make a unique contribution. So the only way you can actually make a unique contribution is by figuring out what's already been done, what's already been written, what's already been explored or investigated, and then trying to assess what hasn't been done as well, and stepping into that space and making your contribution in that unique space through that particular research gap. So for the writer, reviewing the literature can be a means of also learning from others' thought processes. once you begin to read various authors' journal articles, for example, or you may look at books or book chapters, you'll begin to understand sort of where they're coming from. And then you'll begin to be able to write up what it is they're trying to say, but also add your spin on it in terms of adapting it to your study. It's a way of, expanding your view of a particular field, because you'll never really know about a field until you engage with the literature around that field. I know a lot of research students may have done their master's in that particular area that they're going to base their doctorate on, and they may feel like, oh, well, we know the field. But from experience, if you just look at literature from one year to the next, there's major developments, there's thousands of pieces of information that have come through in that time. There's many journal articles that could be written in that field. There's many books, there's many book chapters. And we essentially live in an information age. So there's always information being pumped out in a particular area or field. And so even if you know that area or field, it's very important to keep abreast with changes in it. And then the literature review is also becoming familiar with different theoretical perspectives. So here you're talking not just about the content matter around a particular area or field, but also how it's approached theoretically. So particular subjects can be approached from different theoretical perspectives, and you may not really think about it until you engage with the literature and you're like, okay, so this author approached this thing I'm looking at from a different theoretical perspective. It can be quite interesting, and it can open your mind to the various approaches that you could possibly take in approaching a particular phenomenon or field or subject. And of course, as I said earlier, it's about looking at parallel developments or things that are happening simultaneously in this area or field that is happening as time passes by. So you can see a lot of important things that maybe one would not have thought about. I know research students think literature review is just about, summarizing the information out there and to get that chapter 2 done. But as you can see, it is a tool for getting a lot of other thought processes moving in your mind as a researcher. And it can be used to define a research area or topic. So this is especially relevant for, if you're in that phase as a doctoral candidate where you may not be too sure about what your specific topic will be, you haven't really constructed your proposal as yet, and you're a bit confused about, which direction to go forward with or which topic to choose. So here, literature review is very important, because it's only when you stop and actually begin to read around a particular research area or topic that you may have a light bulb moment in terms of, okay, you know what, this area or topic is quite complex and it seems like everything is covered in it, but there's this one sort of research gap or sort of area that hasn't been covered or hasn't been covered comprehensively or hasn't been sort of touched upon in a particular way that can then form the point of departure for your entire research study or research topic. So here I talk about before the proposal stage. So when you're thinking about or brainstorming around a particular topic to base your PhD on, it can also be very, very helpful. And I've found through my own experience and through my experience with students is many of them will come with a particular topic. And as they begin to engage with the literature, that topic can, evolve drastically, or it can change entirely as well. So that's the power of, reviewing the literature, that it can change your entire mind in terms of, what topic you initially started with and what topic you eventually decide to pursue and write up your proposal around. So it's quite powerful. And again, coming back to this notion of literature review as being that conventional chapter 2 in your dissertation, the one thing I always tell my research students is that this act of reviewing literature and writing it up and synthesizing it and evaluating it and examining it, it has to continue throughout your thesis write-up. So it's not just about, I have to do this chapter 2, let me sit down, look for information and write it up. if you have that kind of mindset, then you are in the wrong mindset, because if you are not reading literature and engaging with literature from the beginning, from before you write your proposal, during during your write-up of the proposal itself, whilst constructing your chapter 2, and then throughout the different chapters of the dissertation write-up, and even after, you're missing out on a very significant leverage point for enhancing the criticality of your dissertation. So it has to continue throughout the duration of the thesis. And I'm just going to show you here in terms of what exactly that means. You can just have a quick look here, but I'll also go through the various bullet points. But if you have a quick scan read, you can actually see that this idea of looking for literature, reviewing it, and writing it up takes place at various points or processes of your dissertation, pre-dissertation writing and post-dissertation writing. So initially, as I said before, you could engage with the literature if you're not too sure about what particular topic you'd like to investigate with your doctoral studies. And so you could use it as a tool to gap spot or to look for those areas where you can make a unique or novel contribution. So as I said, for doctoral candidates, this is really, really important. And you probably hear this over and over again about, as a doctoral candidate, you have to make a unique contribution. You have to make a novel contribution. And the only way you can do this is to actually figure out, what hasn't been covered in the vast landscape of what has been covered. So I know with my PhD studies, this is the area that took me the longest, because every time I would think, oh, well, I've got this really novel idea for my doctoral studies. And then I would go on to sort of Google Scholar and hit search, and there would be thousands, hundreds and thousands of papers, journal articles, books, book chapters on that particular topic. And then I was like, back to the drawing board. So it's a very important step in not only learning about a particular area or concept or theory, but giving you great leverage in terms of, if you're not too sure about which topic or area you want to write around on your in your dissertation, this is a very important step in spotting those gaps and seeing how you can make that unique contribution as a doctoral candidate. So there is that important gap spotting, the most power that you can get in terms of identifying gaps, because I know this is something that a lot of research students struggle with, is trying to identify what hasn't been done. And the only way, as I said, of doing that is immersing yourself in the literature around a particular phenomenon or subject or field or area. And once you do that, there's no way that you won't be able to spot that gap and make a contribution through your doctoral studies. And then we spoke about the second bullet point a little bit in terms of, you'll have to have the sort of shortened or condensed version of the literature review in your proposal. In some institutions and proposals, this is known as a preliminary literature review, or, brief background. Sometimes it's also stated in the proposal as a brief background. But the idea here is to show that you have engaged with the literature out there on your particular area or phenomenon or topic. And another mistake that research students tend to make is it's very general. So they provide a condensed literature review that is very general. It just says, Smith says this, Singh says this, Reddy says that, Thuli says this. But essentially, the purpose of this condensed literature review is to provide justification, and a strong justification, for why it is that you have picked that particular topic, for why it is that you have constructed those particular research hypotheses or objectives or questions, depending on whether your study is quantitative or qualitative or mixed methods. And it's not just about giving a brief background. It is about providing sources of information that explain clearly to the reader or to the reviewer of your proposal that I've decided to do this topic because of these arguments made through the use of the selection and analysis of particular pieces of literature or content. So it's not just about putting as much there as you can. It's about very carefully selecting sources of literature or information that support the argument you're trying to make as to why a committee should allow you to pursue studies around this particular topic or phenomenon, because in most cases, your proposal will have to be defended. So your literature review is just not information about your topic, but it's your first point of departure in making a justification for why your study is valuable and what it will contribute. And of course, then, you use it to formulate your research problem, your research questions, your research objectives, your hypothesis, and it will also influence your methodology to a certain extent. And then once your proposal is, reviewed and it's accepted, it's defended, it's accepted, you then have the task of developing a longer or a fuller chapter, which is your conventional chapter 2 literature review. Now, even though I say chapter 2, it really just depends on your study. So some people may have two chapters of literature review, and so one will become chapter 2, and the next one will be chapter 3. So it isn't always that you have to stuff all the literature in that chapter 2. You can split it out depending on the nature of the information you've reviewed and whether it makes critical sense to put it into one or two chapters. And then that becomes your literature review chapters. So in terms of how that looks, there's no fixed and fast rule, and it's a conversation you have to have with your supervisor. It's a conversation you have to have with yourself and think critically in terms of what makes sense in terms of how I structure my information in my particular dissertation. Yes, Prof, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks very much. Can I just ask you this question? You see, normally your chapter 1 is introduction, right? And your chapter, let's say 4 or possibly 5, might be on research methodology. Now, in between, we sort of informally refer to those chapters as literature review chapters. And included in the literature review chapters, it would be a theoretical framework, because one of the chapters would be theoretical framework, but it's also including literature review. So would it be in order if we generally talk about literature review chapters, but it also includes the theoretical framework?
Yes, definitely. I feel like the theoretical review should emerge from the literature because it's around the theory around a particular topic or phenomenon. So it can form part of the literature review. I know sometimes in the proposal, there's a heading called theoretical framework, but when you move on to extending it to a full dissertation, it can definitely form part of the literature review. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So moving on to the fourth bullet point there, the literature review can also provide support for a particular theory or methodology or research design approach and or tool. So here we're talking about whatever your study is, you have to have a particular way in which you're going to approach that topic. So that's your research methodology. And there's common research methodologies, like you have your qualitative, your quantitative, and mixed methods approaches. But some studies may employ a particular methodology that is unique and that others may not have, necessarily heard of, or that's unique in the global south, but that has been used in the global north. So in these cases, when you move away from those conventional quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research approaches, you need to also use the literature to provide support for that particular theory, methodology, or research design approach. So I'll give you an example here. For my doctoral studies, I used a systems thinking approach known as qualitative system dynamics. And at the time when I did my dissertation, this approach was not well known in the South African context. It had been used a bit in America and the UK quite extensively. But in terms of the global South, it was still sort of gaining traction at the time when I did my dissertation. And in my mind, I knew that if I had sort of a local examiner or a local reader who wasn't from, the global north, UK, America, they may not really understand how I came to my findings if they didn't understand that particular methodology. So a decision was made between me and my supervisor to include a chapter on this particular methodology just because it was so unique. And we were worried that, if there was an examiner or a reader that didn't understand that particular methodology, they may not, understand the overall study. So for me, what that looked like was having a conventional literature review chapter and then also having a literature review chapter that was based on this particular systems thinking methodology. And so what that essentially entailed was me reviewing a lot of literature around that methodology and then writing it up as a chapter so that anybody who would review my study would understand this is the methodology I used, this is why I used it, these are the particular steps that constitute that methodology, these were some of the sort of limitations or strengths of using that methodology, and they would be more likely to then understand, my findings, how I analyzed the findings, how I wrote up my discussion, and how I came up with the conclusions and recommendations. So you can see in that example, knowledge of the methodology was extremely important. And if I had missed that step or just had sort of a small paragraph in the methodology chapter, I don't think anybody would have understood all the chapters that came thereafter. And so I speak here about making critical choices when it comes to your research dissertation. The shortfall of the fact that you may be exposed to research workshops or dissertations is that you may be privy to thinking that things have to be done in a specific step-by-step way. But the beauty of research is that you can apply, and you should be applying your critical thinking as a doctoral candidate based on the uniqueness of your study and based on conversations between you and your supervisor to come to unique approaches in how you construct and present your study. So for me, that looked like having another chapter related to the methodology. But for everybody sitting here, it could look a lot different.
Nikita, I'm just wondering, we've got one or two questions in the chat. I think as we're going along, let's address them so that it doesn't accumulate. Now, the first one, very briefly, is from Cyril Sabello. What triggers the decision to split literature review into two chapters? After you respond, I'll give you the other question. Thanks.
Okay, so as I explained, the first consideration should be that your literature review chapter shouldn't be too long in the context of all the other chapters. So if you feel like, by including a lot of information, it's going to get too long and you still need all that other information, then that could be one consideration in splitting it into two chapters. The other example was in terms of my study, where the methodology was unique, and I had to include information on the methodology in order to ensure that all the following chapters made sense. Then that would be the consideration in having two separate literature reviews. Because remember, because it was related to my methodology, I couldn't sort of smash it in with the literature around my topic, which was around nonprofit organizations. It just wouldn't make sense putting that all into one chapter. So that was the reasoning in terms of then splitting it into two chapters, simply because one was about the content of the study and the other was about the methodology. So again, it comes back to this notion of applying critical thinking in terms of your own study, because every person's study sitting in the room is different, right? It's unique. So you have to think in terms of your overall dissertation, what would make sense? Would it make sense to have two chapters? Would it make sense to have three sometimes? But the important consideration here is ensuring that you are well aware of your word count limitations on your dissertation and that you don't exceed that, because that's very easy to do as well.
Yeah, Nikita, it seems you answered the second question. Can I have more than two literature review chapters? I think you answered that, yes. But I think you need to respond to this. I'm not getting anything about the conceptual framework. How many theories is one expected to use, or can you respond to that very briefly?
Yeah, so again, in terms of the amount of information in your conceptual framework or the number, or even the theoretical framework for that matter, you have to again come back to what is your study on. And, I wouldn't be able to answer that question conclusively if I didn't know what your particular topic is on, and also what you are aiming to achieve in how you approach that study. So it's very unique and it's very intimate to each person's phenomenon that they're looking at. Some people can have a theoretical framework, some people can have one conceptual framework and it's sufficient. But again, approaching your study and your dissertation with creativity and criticality, what makes sense in the context of your particular study? That's the first question you have to ask yourself, and then make those decisions after that.
Right, thanks. I think let's proceed.
Okay. Okay, so as I said, this act of reading literature and writing it up, if you're just doing it for the literature review or to write up your literature review, I would say that you're definitely doing something wrong. Because even as you transition into writing up your discussion chapter, you will need literature to support your arguments. You will need literature to be able to discuss your findings in the final write-up. So the act of reading, it must be continuous. The act of analyzing literature, it must be continuous throughout the dissertation. And program your mind to that from before you even begin the proposal. Even if it means, taking one journal article per day and reading it. At the end of the month, you have 30 journal articles that have been read. And that's a lot of information, that's a lot of information. And I know it can seem overwhelming, especially with the way in which certain articles are written in a very technical or academic fashion. It can seem very overwhelming. But I think if you can commit to maybe reading 1 or 2 chapters per day, it definitely adds up. When it comes to the discussion chapter, you can use some of the literature that you were exposed to when you were writing up your literature review. But remember, generally, from the time in which you wrote your literature review chapter to the time in which you'll write your discussion chapter, generally a few years would have passed. And so the field would have evolved considerably from when you wrote your literature review chapter. So don't just rely on the stuff that you read to construct your literature review chapter. Definitely keep reading throughout your dissertation process. And then when it comes to writing the discussion chapter as well, you're going to have to engage once again in the literature to be able to support your findings. So as you can see, it is something that is unavoidable. It is something that has to take place before you do your proposal. Again, to write up that condensed literature review in the proposal, and then also to, do that literature review chapter or chapters, and then again, in tying everything together in the discussion chapter, you need that constant engagement with the information that is out there. So before examination, before you send your thesis for examination, again, you're going to have to go through that process where your supervisor reads your dissertation. You're going to have to go through the process of, reading your whole dissertation, rereading it to make sure that it's in tip-top shape to submit for examination. And you may find, as I spoke earlier, that some of the citations are outdated now because maybe you wrote your literature review in, 2023 and now it's 2026. So definitely a lot has happened in the field between 2023 and 2026, and you now need to add more, new references or add recent or significant developments in the field. So before examination, again, reading what's out there, trying to update all citations, trying to add more recent citations, and also trying to make sure that significant developments in the field are incorporated in your dissertation before it's sent out for examination. So post-examination, so you send your dissertation for examination, and examiners, a very common feedback from examiners is that, you may have not included the significant study that's very relevant to your topic because, these examiners will be sort of subject matter experts. on your topic or phenomenon that you have investigated, and they immersed in the field, so they know what's happening in it in a daily basis. So they may know of, like an article or two that is very relevant to your topic, but that you haven't included. And so often examiners will make a suggestion when you get your comments back from the examiners that, you've missed out the study, or your citations are a bit dated. Can you update it? Can you make them more recent? Can you include these missed pieces of information? So again, in that scenario, what does it entail? It entails going back into the literature, diving back into the literature, trying to examine all these recent developments, and incorporating that now when you are addressing the examiner's comments. So it doesn't end there. I know students get very happy when they've incorporated the examiner's comments and they send it off to be checked either by the supervisor or by the examiner again. And they are given the green light and they think, well, okay, I don't have to look at another journal article again. I don't have to read another book or online book. I don't have to look at another book chapter. And then your supervisor calls you or emails you and says, okay, Mr. or Mrs. or actually Dr. So-and-so, it's about time that, we get a few publications. You want to ensure that whatever you found in your study is put out there into the world, that people, know about the effort you put into your study. They know about what you found through your study. And so we need to craft a few publications and attempt to, send it out into the world for publication. And again, what some students will do is that they will take the thesis and they will just sort of copy and paste sections of it, of the literature review, and put that into sort of a journal article format. But why this is not advisable is because, again, from the period in which you addressed or sent your dissertation for submission for examination, or addressed the examiner's comments and then sent it back, there's again time lapses in between all of those processes. And so when it eventually comes to, for example, you sitting down to put together a journal article that you're going to send out for publication, because time has lapsed, again, you could have missed significant studies, significant developments in the field, evolutions in the area that you're looking for. Lots of stuff could have been missed in those time lapses. And so even at this process where you're just using the thesis as the basis for creating journal articles or book chapters or conference proceedings or papers, you still have to go back into the literature, do your searches again, and figure out what has evolved in the time between the last time you looked at the literature, and incorporate that as well. So again, for those of you who are maybe doing PhD by publication, it's very important, even when constructing those publications, even if you've already finished sort of reviewing the literature, to keep going back and forth in terms of ensuring you haven't missed anything. Because when it comes to journal articles especially, reviewers are very pedantic about your references and your citations. And often, I know even in my experience of trying to publish journal articles, the number one feedback from journal article reviewers is that the citations or references are dated. And so sometimes if you have very sort of generous journal article reviewers, they'll actually they'll mention some topical studies in that particular area that you've investigated through your journal article. Or they may say something like, your citations are a bit dated or outdated. Can you sort of update your references and citations? And so that would mean you, again, engaging with the literature in order to do that. So it's, again, very important when crafting those publications during and post-examination, because some doctoral candidates will do it, they'll craft journal articles as they're doing their dissertation and they'll send it out for publishing. But especially for those who only start that journal article construction process after your thesis has been examined, you have to ensure that there's no time lapses in terms of the newness or currentness of your citations. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. And again, I spoke to this point about when addressing reviewers' feedback in terms of your publications. They may say, you know what, look, these citations are a bit outdated. Can you please update them? And finally, it is very important in terms of keeping abreast of updates in the field, which was something I spoke about continuously throughout the previous bullet points, is the only way you can really keep abreast of changes or evolutions or development in the field is to keep reading and keep engaging with the literature. So I know the busier you get, this is more difficult. But even if it means committing to, reading one piece of information, whether that may be a journal article, whether that may be a book chapter or, a few pages of a book, I think that will accumulate over time into you keeping abreast of changes instead of really not knowing what's happening in the field. So moving on to the literature review process. Now, the literature review process it's a very complex process. It's also very unique to each researcher, to each doctoral candidate, even unique in terms of, what guidance has your supervisor given you in terms of how to approach this activity of writing up your literature review or even looking for literature review. So on this slide, I've just summarized, the basic things that a literature review should involve. But as I said, how it looks for you will be very different for the person, a doctoral colleague who's also studying. It could just be that you'll approach things in very different ways. So don't take this as a hard and fast rule. But as I say, continuously adapt the way you do things in terms of your own study and in terms of your own working style as well. But in terms of the basics, and a literature review must begin with, identifying information that is linked or relevant to your study. So you really want to ensure that in the beginning, you are aware of what your research topic or area is, or even field is, so you don't sort of read too widely. Because the thing is, there is a lot of information out there. I'm not going to lie to you. In whatever you're studying, whether you're approaching it from a quantitative or qualitative approach, whether you're looking at something as broad as leadership or something as specific as a particular leadership style, I think sort of students underestimate how much information there is actually out there. There's a lot of information on everything out there. So you want to begin to develop skills to identify information that is specifically linked or relevant to your study. And an important part of this process is making sense of and organizing the information. Again, I say here, you need to consider yourself in this process, because a lot of my research students, they sort of ask me, what must I do? And then if I tell them something like, okay, do a mind map, a few weeks later, they'll come back and they'll be like, I really struggled with putting the information into a mind map because I'm more of a numbers person. So this is why I always tell them, think about yourself. You are the main person in this whole process, and you have to figure out ways of doing things and organizing your information that makes sense to you and suits you. So if you're a numbers person, you use numbers. If you're a words person, use words. If you're into, learning through seeing things visually in figures and images, then you can use things like diagrams and mind maps. But whatever way you use, you need to think before you even start collecting information through your literature review about how you would make sense of and organize the information. Otherwise, it can become very, very overwhelming very quickly. And the saddest thing is, having spent hours looking for pieces of information, monographs, whatever that may be, and then sort of, not having a way to organize the information and forgetting what you've read or forgetting, where this information came from. And it's a very sad thing because there's so much information you'll never really be able to backtrack. So I tell my doctoral candidates, figure out before you even touch the literature or before you even begin reading it, how am I going to organize this information? How am I going to make sense of all the information coming my way? How am I going to record my thoughts as I read through the information? And it should never be about just reading and reading and reading and reading, because you're definitely going to forget most of that information. There has to be strategies to, make points about what you've read, to interrogate the literature, and to do that in real time. Because if you leave it for too long, you're definitely not going to be able to recall what you read. You're not going to be able to recall the arguments that you thought about in your head based on that information, and that would be a pity, because all of this, looking for information, searching for information, analyzing information, writing it up, it takes a lot of time and energy and effort. So we want to ensure that all the time and energy and effort is funneled into a way that, or rather channeled into a way that is going to have the most benefits for the construction of your literature review and your overall dissertation as well. Another tip is, you're going to get all this information coming at you as you read journal articles, as you read books, as you read book chapters. And so beyond just being very strict in terms of how you organize the information, you need to develop a coherent understanding in terms of how you put that literature together. So a question I often get is like, all this information is coming my way, but how do I put it down in the literature review? And I often tell students to use the funnel approach, which is, yes, there's a lot of information. The first thing is you have to make sure it's sort of relevant to your study, like the first bullet point says. But another important consideration is that you need to structure it in a way that it's not only relevant to your study, but it starts from sort of the general observations around the topic or around your study. And then slowly, as each heading or subheading proceeds, you're getting more specific to your particular topic. So you should essentially end off your literature review with literature being focused specifically at your particular research topic. So for example, if you think about if you are doing a study on leadership, then, for example, you could begin your literature review with sort of definitions or general understandings around the concept of leadership. Because I think it's very important to always start your literature review in terms of defining the concepts that you're using. If it's a study on leadership, what is leadership? How has your second topic could be about something around, how has it developed historically over the years? And then you could even go into, to make it more refined, you could cover things like, different leadership styles or different types of leadership, and then maybe hit on things like, the characteristics of each leadership style or the historical development of each leadership style. So we could speak here of things like, for example, transformational leadership, charismatic leadership. You could look at each of those ones and go into the characteristics and development of each of those styles or types of leadership. And then you can refine the approach to get to the bottom of that sort of funnel in terms of, okay, if my study is on transformational leadership in municipality X, then end of that literature review looking specifically about transformational leadership. And you could even include information, for example, on leadership dynamics in that particular municipality. Or if there's not enough research around that, you can look at, leadership styles in municipalities in general. So again, how your funnel looks will be very different based on your study as compared to another doctoral candidate. And the aim here is to try to go for more general information to slowly make it more refined and more specific till the information links directly to your particular study topic or study research and objectives as well, because that all needs to be linked. And an important one here, which I'm sure most of you would have heard, is also that we just don't want this grocery list or textbook writing of information at doctoral level and master's level. You need to critically analyze the information and show that you have applied your mind to this information. And it's not just about author X said this, author B said that, author D said that, but what are your thoughts in relation to that information? What relevance does this information have for your particular topic? So move away from that grocery list of, author A said this, author A said that, author B said that, and try to say, okay, if author A said this, so what? So I tell my students, follow that up. If you've written in your MS Word document, author A has said this about, for example, transformational leadership styles, then stop. And before you go on to what author B said and put that as your second sentence, ask yourself, so if author A said this, so what? What relevance does this have to my topic? What relevance does this have to my study? What cognitive shift has this created in my brain in terms of being exposed to this information? And those are just some of the ways to include a more sort of critical analysis aspect of the literature review, instead of it just being about this person said that, that person said this, that person said this. So I know I had attended a workshop a few years back, and the lady who was presenting, she put it very nicely in the sense that she said, picture yourself as a person entering a dinner party, and the people who are sort of seminal authors or even any authors related to your study topic are sitting around this table with you, and they each telling you about their points of perspectives. So that could be akin to what you're reading in a journal article, for example. So if Smith says this, picture Smith as a person at your dinner table telling you about what they said. And then if you read a journal article from sort of Ingobane, then picture him at the table telling you what exactly he's trying to say through this journal article. And you use that same logic with all the authors whose work you're reading. And then she said, you know what, think of yourself as sitting at this dinner table and saying, okay, they've each gone around the table and they've said what they've thought. Now, based on what they've thought, what will you say back to them? You can't regurgitate and say what they've said to you. But in light of everything they've said, how would you contribute to that discussion or conversation? So she said, use that as a logic for reviewing literature and writing it up. Instead of saying, at a dinner party, if you had to repeat what another person said, people will think you're mad, right? So in the same way, with literature review write-ups, ensure that you make your contribution to that dinner table conversation that is beyond what the other people at the table said. So hopefully that can help a bit in terms of introducing this thing of being critical in your literature review chapter. And maybe some of you are already involved in writing up your literature or different chapters of your dissertation. And maybe there was some feedback from your supervisor, or it needs to be more critical. And you're thinking, but I've included this, these journal articles, I've included this book chapter, I've included authors from the global south and the global north, but I don't understand what he or she is saying. Well, that's what they're saying. They're saying, yes, I can hear what everybody else is saying at the dinner table, but I can't hear what your contribution to the dinner table conversation is. And so that's where you have to ensure you're making a contribution to the proverbial dinner table conversation, and it's not just something you've heard from the other guests at the table.
Nikita, I'm just wondering if we can just take two questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Firstly, here somebody says they're doing a PhD by publication. The more I read and write up, I can't help but wonder if I won't be duplicating my arguments when it's time to write a literature review to the thesis.
That's a tricky one in terms of navigating that space. But a very simple solution to that would be to keep reading what you've written. So if you've gone, written half of your literature review chapter, just go back and read it, and you'll immediately pick up if there's too much repetition. Sometimes also the supervisor will look at it and say, well, there's too much repetition here. And usually they don't tell you where that repetition is. So you, again, have to go back, read the chapter, and identify where that repetition is.
And I think the second question here, the person is asking about using old theories, right? And if you're looking at references here, would you, have to refer to recent writings on that? If you can just elaborate. Thanks.
Yeah, so it again depends on your research topic or area because there are very seminal authors and seminal works, important critical works from leading authors in that field. And they can be very dated. This happens a lot in business and management studies where you have models from the 1940s, but you still have to sort of write about it so that because it provides the foundation of everything that comes after. So if it's something that's really important and it provides the foundation for the information that comes later, then I would say include it. You don't have to go into excessive detail around it, but also balance that off with more recent citations as well. So there should be a good balance. It shouldn't be that, if you're looking at the resource-based model, that all your references are old, because there's a lot being done on the resource-based model that has evolved over the years. So you will find a lot of studies done this year, last year, even the year before on that particular model that you can also include, but make sure it's balanced.
Yeah, Gabriel, you wanted to comment.
I think there are also other questions that are coming, which I thought we can also consider in the discussion concerning what you've covered so far. I think one of the questions that has been asked on the platform is one of using illustrations and mind maps in explaining literature. How popular could this be? And the second one, I think you already have covered that on how literature review is continually updated. I think you've covered that question. And I think the other question that also is related to what you've covered so far is how can you make literature review more appealing? Those are some of the questions coming through. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Kumanda. In terms of the mind maps and diagrams, so there's two spaces in which you'd use mind maps and diagrams is initially when you're trying to put all the pieces of information that you're reviewing together very quickly into one page. That's when you'd use a mind map or diagram of another nature. But there's also the other aspect of including diagrams in the literature review chapter. So I wouldn't advise in terms of including mind maps, the stuff you doodle. I wouldn't say include that in your literature review, but you can make neater diagrams that summarize what you're trying to say in a particular paragraph in your literature review. That's very welcome. And I think examiners and readers appreciate that because it gives their eyes a bit of a break from all the textual information. So it's nice to have that, move from words to figures and diagrams. I would say it's a nice addition. But I would say don't put your sort of own doodles into the literature review chapter. Use that to sort of organize your thoughts and organize your information.
I think I could also add from what you just said right now with mind maps and illustrations that these are quite important in visual clarity, where you can organize your complex ideas, theories, and relationships in a visual context. And especially when you're dealing with abstract issues or so on, yes, that becomes important. But the other area also that benefits from these illustrations and mind maps is on the kind of cognitive benefits where you want to enhance in certain issues. You want, especially visual learners, you want to support critical thinking and interconnect in certain things that are evolving. These are some of the areas where those can be useful, but I think you have explained it so well. And I think it's an area where people also need to be very careful when to use it and not overdo it. But it must be done within caution, but it becomes necessary in certain dimensions and important areas. So thank you.
Yes, very true, Prof. The only thing I'd like to add to that, and again, something I've noticed through reviewing students' works and examining journal articles and dissertations, is that sometimes they'll include a figure or a diagram, but there's very little explanation in terms of what is captured in that figure or diagram. And so it's important, if you do include a figure or a diagram in your literature review or anywhere else, even in the discussion chapter for that matter, or your methodology chapter, it's important to explain, even if it's just in one paragraph, what are you trying to say with this particular figure or diagram? And of course, in addition to that, is have the caption explaining in, one line or statement what is in that figure or diagram. But yeah, something I see very often is that students will include a very nice figure or diagram, but there'll be no explanation as to what is in that figure or diagram. And also, more importantly, no explanation of the relevance of that figure or diagram for, whatever comes next in that particular chapter. So those are two things to make sure. If you're including a figure or a diagram, say what's in the figure or diagram, explain it clearly, but also explain why it's relevant to the argument that you're trying to make. Okay, so I think we can move on from this slide. So some considerations in literature review writing, which, will influence, again, there was a question about what makes an interesting literature review. Again, how that looks and how the question is answered will vary depending on, what topic you're investigating, what approach are you taking to investigate that topic. It's also influenced by, the conversations you and your supervisor have in terms of how he or she wants you to, present that information. So there's quite a lot of considerations that go into, constructing a literature review that you're happy with, that your supervisor is happy with, that you would think would make reviewers, examiners, and other people reading your study happy to read that information in that way, in the sense that they'll be able to understand what you're saying. And so it's very difficult to sort of answer questions in terms of, what makes a good literature review, because there's so many components that go into making a good literature review, but also in making an interesting, stimulating literature review as well. But essentially, anybody who's engaged with literature review should be demonstrating knowledge in a particular area or field, and also applying skills in things like information seeking. Because remember, the information you write up in your literature review or wherever that information is, it is sort of showing whoever's reviewing that information in terms of how you seek information and how you present that information, and also are you able to make a critical assessment of the information? So coming back to that example of, are you just saying what other guests at the dinner table are saying, or are you adding to this conversation or debate that is happening at the dinner table? Your literature review writing can also be influenced, of course, by the academic level of your research project. So how your literature review looks will differ depending on, the level of where you are in terms of honors or master's or PhD. Since this is a doctoral research clinic, your literature review has to be especially more critical, more innovative, because you need to make a contribution through how you review literature and how you present it. Again, other considerations that could influence how literature review pans out is the literature review from a full research dissertation? Is it a smaller research assignment? Or even things like, is it a degree by coursework? Because if you have an MBA dissertation, for example, or mini thesis, as we like to call it, then if you look at the length of a mini research dissertation as opposed to a full research dissertation, there's vast differences. And so this will influence as literature because in a mini dissertation, that has to be shorter as well. And an important thing is use your word count as a guide from the beginning. So again, because this is a doctoral research workshop, you'll know that your PhD dissertation is 80,000 to 100,000 word count. And so, use that as a guide from the beginning, because you wouldn't want to sort of exceed a particular chapter and then have to backtrack and delete stuff, because that whole process is also very difficult in terms of trying to reduce a particular chapter or word count. It can be very, very tedious. So have those word counts stuck on your wall. And also think about, again, there's no hard and fast rule in terms of how many words per chapter. I know research students tend to ask me that question all the time. And why I tell them there's no hard and fast rule is because, again, it will come back to your study. As I told you in earlier in the presentation, with me, because I was using a unique methodology, I had to have a separate literature review for that methodology. And what this meant is that I then had to account for the word count for each of those chapters in the overall dissertation. And so it took a bit of maneuvering in terms of ensuring that I was still stuck to that 80,000 to 100,000 word count for the dissertation. So it's very, very unique to your study. Again, if you're confused, it's something that is worth sort of taking up with your supervisor, discussing. That's what they're there for. If you're confused about, okay, I need to do 1 or 2 literature reviews, what does that look like in terms of the word count? Have that conversation with them. They would be more than willing to engage and guide you around that. And again, it really depends on what your study is on, how you're going to approach it, and what contribution you want to make in terms of, you can structure a dissertation in a certain way to make a certain contribution. So it all depends on those factors as well. And then the context. The context also influences your literature review. Is it a professional report? Is it, is it a funding proposal? Is it market research? But as I said, since this is a doctoral research workshop, that will influence what your literature review looks like. It will be lengthy. It will have to be critical. It will have to be innovative, and it will have to contribute to making a unique contribution through your study. And then literature reviews are also influenced by, the research methodology you adopt in terms of, are you adopting a quantitative approach? Are you adopting a qualitative research approach, which is based more on words and meaning? Or are you using both a mixed method study? And for example, if you're doing a quantitative study, then you may want to lean on more information like statistics or reports. If it's qualitative, you may look for pieces of information that interrogate a concept at a deeper level. And then if you are doing a mixed method study, you will have to look for, both these kinds of information to include in your literature review. And then a final consideration is, what area is your research dissertation or research topic on? Because the kind of literature review you do, for example, for a medical student would be very different from, say, somebody coming from the social business management fields, or even education for that matter. So again, we can't have those quick, fast answers for every doctoral candidate, because it will really depend on a lot of factors that will influence what your literature review needs to look like and do. So I'm just going to stop there and ask if there's any other questions, Prof. Reddy and Prof. Kabanda, that I can address before I move on.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Nikita, for that incredibly brilliant roadmap. There are 3 questions that are common with some doctoral students we've been asking here. I think the first one is a question on how do you balance your personal views against those from literature in an argument. That's the first one. And then the second one is when should you use conceptual definitions? Should conceptual definitions be put in the introduction introduction chapter instead of literature review chapter. And I think the other question, I think, is partially covered with what you're talking about on the relevance of research methods used and geographical contexts. When do you do that, and how do you do it from your experience? Those are the critical questions that have been asked here, but they're also quite common with majority of doctoral students sometimes. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Prof, for those. In terms of the first question, which is balancing personal views with the views of other authors, again, I come back to that example of the dinner debate or conversation. Yes, you have to include, I wouldn't say personal views, but I would say critical interrogation of the literature. Because the reason I say this is what some students also do is that they write too colloquially. So they write as if, they're having a conversation with me or with a friend. And then we have to remember in those instances that we have to uphold academic writing. So writing academically, writing critically is very important, more so than, introducing your personal views. That is where your voice comes through, right? So in a literature review, sometimes the difficulty is that because we have to lean so much on literature, the question then becomes, okay, so where do I now insert my voice? And the answer to that is you need to insert your voice in terms of if you have included information from multiple authors and your mind is telling you, okay, they've said this, but now I feel this, then that is the green light to say, okay, this is where I can contribute my voice to and my personal views. But ensure that when you incorporate your personal views or critical thoughts, that again, it's written in an academic language, it's written critically. You also have to support your arguments. So you support your arguments with what other authors have said, but you can include sort of your own thoughts, but ensure that it's always written in very critical academic fashion. Otherwise, it can seem too conversational. So that's an eternal struggle for research students is, how do I include my voice in the dissertation? And as I said, if there's a strong thought that is emerging in your mind as you read the literature, then that is the green light to include your take on that, on what you've read. Another tip is to also, instead of, writing in terms of that laundry list of saying author A said this, author B said this, what you actually do is group what these authors have found into themes. So you group them into themes, and then once you've discussed that theme and supported that theme with various authors' works, you then provide your critical insight with regard to that theme. So why this is a good approach is it moves beyond just sort of criticizing or critiquing a particular author to critically exploring a particular theme in the literature. And I think that's a better approach than targeting certain authors. In terms of the second question around when should we include conceptual definitions, should this be in the introduction or should this be in the literature review? So that's an important question. Because essentially, remember that your introduction would have been your proposal. So then it becomes important if you're using particular concepts to define those concepts in the proposal, which will later become your introduction. So it has to be there. It has to be in the introduction / proposal. But you can then explore that concept in greater depth in the literature review. So have sort of a short summarized understanding of that concept in the introduction or your proposal, and then expand that in the literature review would be my best advice. Yeah.
Nikita, can I just come in? I think somebody asked a question on the number of words. And here, I think we have to hold the supervisor promoter accountable because they are responsible for managing the process. Firstly, if you're looking at a proposal, it should be about 6,500 words. Look, you can have an additional 500 words, but certainly you can't go to 11,000 words because you're going to find reviewers are not going to look at the work in a hurry, right? And then additionally, if you're looking at each of the chapters, somebody asked something on chapter 1. Chapter 1 shouldn't be more than 30 pages. And I came across one piece of work recently where the first chapter was 90 pages. And what this student did was all the information on research methodology was put in the first chapter, and there was no chapter 4. You see, so that's also a major flaw. And if you're looking at the number of words for a thesis, it's 80,000 words. Look, you can go up to 100,000, stretching it. But you must also realize examiners don't want to examine work where there's 128,000 words or 130,000 words. You know, you're going to have a problem here.
Mm.
So at the end of the day, the supervisor or promoter has to manage the process right from the beginning and discipline the student. Thanks.
No, definitely, Prof. Those are very important observations. And to add to that, I would say with the PhD, the minimum word count is 80,000 words. And I would say try to stick to below that, because remember that, as Prof said, examiners are reading multiple dissertations, usually in their December holidays, July holidays, when they get the time to do so. They really get irritated and frustrated when the document is too long, or it's too lengthy, or there's unnecessary repetition. So I know sometimes with research students, they see this 80,000, 100,000, and 100,000 word count, and then they feel as they're writing the chapters that they have to write a lot in order to hit that target. But I would say you'd rather write less than more and add a little bit at the end, because in my knowledge, usually students do write more. They're a bit apprehensive in the beginning, so that they're not going to write enough. But when they get to the end of the dissertation, they've actually written more than they needed, and they're pleasantly surprised, because there's such anxiety around writing, especially when it comes to dissertations. And they really have this thought in their head that they're not going to be able to write that many words. And 9 out of 10 times when we get to the end of that process, when the PhD is done, they are like, oh, I'm going to have to reduce this because it's too long. I didn't even think that I could get to this word count. So definitely aim for a lower word count, because I know even with aiming with a lower word count, you'll see at the end that it's actually greater than the word count that you need, and you may have to sort of reduce and cut here and there. But another important consideration is coming back to that question that was asked about how do I make sure that I'm not repeating myself or repeating particular arguments or debates. And it's very important here, because the other disturbing thing I do notice with students is that they don't read their work. They don't read the chapters. And so when I read it, I automatically pick up that there's a lot of repetition, which would have logically been picked up if a person did read their contribution or their chapter. So it's very important here. I know it's a little bit irritating to have to backtrack and read your own work over and over again. But this is a foolproof way of ensuring that, there's not that repetition of arguments, of sentences, of statements, and also ensuring that, you give the best possible version of that document to your supervisor and to the examiners, and that they don't pick that up and send it back to you and say, okay, well, you need to revise this, and that's just going to slow down your whole process. So definitely read through your chapters, even if it means, you don't have the time to read through the whole chapter. Then break it down into parts and read and reread those chapters to make sure, that there's no repetition, there's no grammatical errors, everything is cited properly, everything is written properly, there's no typos, there's no errors. I know that's pretty sort of basic information, but a lot of students actually don't do it. So it's important to try to keep to that as much as possible. But I think on that note, let me just see what's next. Okay, let me go through the purpose of the literature review, and then we can take a break, because we'll be at halfway. So as we spoke about earlier, literature review, yes, it provides context for your work. What does this mean? This means that when you're writing your literature in your proposal, your literature review has to make a strong argument for why you are doing that study. Because remember, your proposal will be reviewed, you have to defend it, you have to present it. So it must contribute very strongly to saying this is the context for my work and this is why I want to investigate or do the study, to say in layman's terms. The purpose of the literature review, as you may all know now, is what have previous scholars written on the topic. So if you come back to that dinner table conversation example, what are other people at the dinner table? What are they saying? You know, what are they saying about this particular topic or research area? And through that, also identifying the main and relevant models and theories for your research. So this is an important one because a lot of students overlook the fact that when you read a journal article, for example, especially journal articles, you will see that, yes, this journal article is related to your research topic, but the way that author or authors have approached that topic could be very unique in terms of the models or theories they've used. So we often get a lot of research students who are confused about things like conceptual models, conceptual frameworks, and theoretical frameworks. And they really have no idea about what framework to sort of use to guide their study. And this immediately tells me that they haven't read deeply enough, because it's almost automatic that as you read these journal articles, you will automatically see how other authors have approached this particular research topic or area and what models and theories they have used. And that can give you insight in terms of what models and theories you can use to guide your study, but also remember that sweet spot of that gap, trying to identify, okay, these models and theories have been used, also provides a foundation for you to determine what hasn't been used. And again, that's a space where you can then contribute as a doctoral candidate. So doctoral candidates tend to think you have to contribute in terms of the research topic or area, but you can make a contribution through how you approach that research topic or area via the methodology that you use. Again, coming back to my example of my doctorate studies, I used that systems thinking methodology to understand nonprofit organizational sustainability. And so even though there was a lot out there in terms of information on nonprofit organizational sustainability, there wasn't anything that had approached this topic using a systems thinking methodology, and definitely not from a qualitative system dynamics methodology. So I was making a contribution, a unique contribution, a novel contribution through the methodology more than the research topic or area. So see, even thinking in terms of out of the box in that regard can help you to make a unique or novel contribution in your doctoral studies. Again, the literature review is about discovering relevant material that could enhance your research. Again, this could enhance your research area or topic, or even through the act of identifying models and theories that were used, you can then hit upon a model or theory that can be used to enhance your particular study, which you may not have thought of before. It provides a justification of your study. I think I said this quite a few times throughout the earlier parts of the presentation. Always ask yourself, so what? I'm including this information. It shouldn't be just for the purpose of, constructing that literature review page in my proposal or my literature review chapter. Everything I do in this literature review should link back to my research topic or area and should provide a justification for it, essentially, because it's not just words in your dissertation. It's there for a purpose, and the purpose is justifying and contextualizing the thing you're wishing to investigate. A basic one is, we'll use literature review to evaluate other people's work and to develop an understanding of theory and method. And again, something that I've spoken to before in terms of very strategic tool for identifying those research gaps or gap spotting, as they call it, in terms of what may not have been done. Again, very important for doctoral candidates because it's through sort of jumping into the literature review, reading, and figuring out, okay, this is where I can make my contribution by identifying a particular gap in the literature. So yeah, that summarizes the purpose of the literature review. And I think since it's almost 11:30, we can take a short break if that's okay, Prof. Kabanda and Prof. Reddy.
Yes, I think we can.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can take a short break. Maybe let me just also advise the colleagues that are around that the presentation slides or notes can be shared. You can have access to them, but it's important that you should have registered, or you need to have registered so that we've got access to your email. It may not necessarily be the actual recording on video, but the notes can be shared. So if we just ensure then that you've registered, it will make it easier for us to communicate with you after the workshop. Thank you. So we take a break now. A health break. Do you want 10, 15 minutes? This is almost 11:30 now. Do you want us to resume?
Shall we make it 10 minutes?
10 minutes. Okay, that's okay. Thank you so much. All right.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Kabanda. Okay, we can have a 10-minute break and then we'll be back at 22.
I don't know, Dr. Nikita, I wanted to check whether you are ready now.
Yes, Prof. Kabanda, I'm ready. We can proceed.
All right, okay. I think before we proceed, there was one question that came at the end where someone was asking how best to present a literature review. But perhaps I think that kind of question is already answered by the summary of what we're presenting, where we're indicating that it's important to look at critical engagement that involves systematic evaluation and synthesis and scholarly works that has been done. But most importantly, that you're also emphasizing that it must go beyond just a summary to interrogate, but we must also be able to compare, to contrast, contextualize literature, and take it up further. If you're looking at Bloom's taxonomy, we are not just dwelling on the bottom, who said what and so on, but you want to push to the higher levels. So I think the summary of what you presented appears to cover or answer the question this attendee asked it as to how best should you represent, should you present literature review. Maybe you can comment on that, and then we get started with our session. Continue from there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Kabanda. Yeah, definitely to add to what Prof said, and he summarized it very eloquently there, is again, how the literature review looks will depend on what your particular study or topic is investigating and how you wish to approach it. Some basic elements is that it must have the reference to other authors' work, so that should be in there. It must have your critical interrogation of those authors' works, that must be in there. We spoke a bit about that funnel approach where it must move from, begin with the general, and then as you proceed through your headings and subheadings, your information should get more and more specific and more, excuse me, more and more strongly linked to your particular study topic or area. It should have things like, key concepts that are going to be used in your study over and over again, should be defined, explored, interrogated as well. You can even include, as Prof. Reddy had spoken about earlier, you can include your theoretical framework, because your theoretical framework is the theoretical perspective from which you are going to look at your entire study. So you can include it in your literature review as well. And anything that is pertinent to your study, and that you want to, include in the literature review in terms of, if there's a methodology that other authors have used to understand that particular topic or issue, you can write about it in the literature review as well. So it incorporates a lot of elements, a lot of components, and the most important thing is always, so what I tell my research students to do is to write out, once their proposal has been defended, accepted, and passed, to write down that topic of your study. So whatever was the latest topic that was approved, write it down on a piece of paper and stick it either if you have, if you're working from a particular common area like a study and you're always going to work from that space, stick that topic that you've written on a piece of paper on your wall so that you can see it every single time that you choose to work on your dissertation. Or if you have different workspaces, then stick that piece of paper onto your laptop where you can see it, or onto your computer that you use. Because the point here is you must always be able to link even something as generic as a literature review. You must see a clear link between that literature review and your particular study topic. If you can't see the link, then you're doing something wrong and you need to backtrack and focus on making that link or golden thread much stronger. So those are just some of the other, the core components of a good literature review, the critical components of a conventional literature review. So we spoke a bit about those gaps. And this slide just says a little bit more on this issue of one of the critical purposes of the literature review is, again, defining the gap or finding the spot in the literature that you can then contribute to, because there's not much being done in that area. So it can form the starting point for your research. Remember, we talked about, for those of you who are not sure about what topic to pursue, even before you start your proposal, then engaging with the literature, identifying a gap can actually be the starting point for your research or your study. It can form the point of departure for that particular study. Alternatively, it can also supplement it. So you may not have thought about a particular issue in a particular way, and identifying a particular gap can then just supplement what you're already doing or add to it, or it can move you in a different research direction altogether. So you may find that you didn't really think there was this gap in the literature, but as you engage with the literature, you identify it and you're like, okay, well, this would be a much more novel, interesting place to contribute to than what I had initially envisioned. So it's very important that, again, that the literature review is not just about putting together information, but you see the strategic strength of it in, you can use it to identify these gaps where you can contribute very strongly in a particular field or area. The other important consideration is that I know we speak a lot about gap spotting, but students often forget to write what that actual gap that they have spotted, what the gap that they've spotted is in their dissertation. So they tend to speak to their supervisor and say, okay, you know what, I want to do this study because I've read these articles and I feel like this is not addressed. But when you finally read their proposal or the dissertation, they haven't articulated that at all in that proposal or dissertation. So it's very important, like this image that I've included here, where the author says explicitly, to date, no research on an exercise-based cardiac program appears to have been done in Scotland, and this study is an attempt to fill that gap. So they very, very explicitly state what the gap is and that they are going to try to contribute to that gap. So even if it's something as simple as that, just 2 or 3 sentences saying, this is the gap, and this is where I want to make my contribution, especially at proposal stage, is very important to include. I see some hands raised. Prof. Kabanda, should we address their questions or can I go ahead?
Could look at those that are putting questions in the chat or question answers box. I think if we can attend to those, I think those raising hands, maybe we can deal with them later on, but we want to encourage the attendees to put their questions.
I would also
support
that as well. Let's deal with the question in the chat. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So for those who have raised hands, please put the questions in the chat and we will get to it eventually. Thanks, Prof. Kabanda and Prof. Reddy. We can move on. Okay, so we can move now to the types of literature because, there's this conventional assumption that when it comes to academic writing and dissertations, there's only sort of journal articles and there's books. But as you can see from this list, if you just read through it, there's various types of literature that you can use in your write-up of your literature review, in the write-up of your proposal as well, the literature review section in the proposal. These are all types of information or literature that can be utilized. So at the top, we have those conventional full-length journal articles that you may be quite familiar with at this stage. There's also shorter articles. There's theoretical articles, review articles, practice-oriented articles, and then we have case studies. We have comment and opinion-based pieces. And then in terms of books, you also have your reviews, your book chapters. And then we have this category of information, which is known as gray literature. And it includes things like organizational and governmental documents, working papers, white papers, evaluations, reports, strategic plans, minutes, newsletters, financial statements. So this is especially relevant if you are working on a study that relates to a particular organization or institution, and you need to have these kinds of information in there so that the reader or examiner knows about that particular institution or organization. And the only way to get that information is through sources of information such as these included here. And then we also have conference papers, working papers, and why I say here, and monographs, which are basically long or detailed scholarly pieces of writing on a specific subject, and they're usually from a single author. So I give there the example of a monograph on the art of origami or Japanese paper folding. But why conference papers are important? So I usually have a lot of students who do not look at conference papers. And they always say, well, why should I include this? I don't really see the relevance. And why conference papers and working papers are important is because they represent very topical and current thinking on a particular issue or phenomenon. So remember, with conferences, these authors are writing these conference papers, they're presenting it at conferences, and they're getting feedback from others in the field, which they then incorporate into the conference paper. So you're getting very sort of recent conversations that are happening around this particular issue or topic will be encapsulated more readily in a conference paper than, for example, a book that was published many years ago. So it's nice to look at their conference papers and see, what is being said, what is the thoughts around a particular issue or phenomenon, and what are the current ideas or investigations or evolutions around it. So definitely include those as well. And then we look here at the types of sort of literature and their purpose, because these different sources of information, they have different purposes. So if you look at a book, you're more likely to get information around, if there's a concept, they'll introduce the concept and they'll elaborate it, discuss the concept a bit more. So if you're starting off, so with certain research students, what they'll do is they will do a study on an area that they are new to. And in order to understand that area, they have to understand, the key concepts in that particular field or area. So I often advise my research students who are starting off in a new field or area to consult the types of information that are on the left-hand side of the table. So things like books, theoretical articles, conceptual articles, and comment and opinion articles. And the reason I tell them this is so that they can have a basic understanding. They can start with a basic understanding of what that concept means. And then once they are aware of the key concepts and theories in that particular area, they can then move on to the types of sources in the right-hand side of the table, which is things like those applied research articles, whether they're qualitative or quantitative, such as case studies. And then on the quantitative side, you have your surveys, methodological articles, reviews such as literature reviews, meta-analysis, and citation analysis. So this basically means that there will be, for example, journal articles that will just be reviewing an entire area or concept. And they may not be specifically applying the concept, but they're trying to chart the development of this concept over time. And then you have things like practice-oriented articles and monographs, like we spoke about earlier. And the whole essence of all the sources of information on the right-hand side of the table is that they then take those concepts that you would have read about in the left-hand side of the table, and they begin to apply and interrogate these concepts to different settings and through different approaches, like qualitative or quantitative approaches. So you're not really going to be able to understand very readily the sources of information on the left-hand side if you don't understand the basic concepts and relationships they are talking about, which you can only get from the stuff on the left-hand side. So if you're new in an area, start from the left and then move towards the right. And that will give you not only the foundation to understand what you're reading about, but also then to understand how it's applied in different contexts and through different methodologies. Okay, so now we'll move into the second part of today's presentation, which is, it's good to know all of this information about the purpose of a literature review, what it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to look like and feel like, how it's supposed to read. But when it comes to the actual activity of sitting down and having to sort of write up all the literature you have been exposed to, that can be a totally different activity, right? Because we're moving now away from the theory into the actual activity of having to construct the literature review. So I call this the technical considerations you need to apply in writing up your literature review. So when it comes to literature review writing, as we've heard from people sitting in the room today, is that, usually I would have asked, what are your major concerns regarding constructing a literature review? But I'm very happy that people have been putting into the chat box some of their, concerns or queries regarding a literature review. So we've essentially covered this question. And I know there's probably a lot more questions, a lot more concerns about constructing a literature review. But I think the great thing about, people asking these questions and me being able to respond, and Prof. Kabanda and Prof. Reddy as well, is that you're able to learn through your other colleagues sitting in the virtual room as well. So thanks to everybody who did, pose some questions, concerns, because at least we've started this conversation already, and it will continue throughout the presentation. Okay, so the first step in, constructing or technically putting together the literature review is how do I find information? How do I find information that I'll put into my literature review chapter, for example? And I would say that a very, very good tip is to begin with your library databases in order to be able to source information. And it can be quite overwhelming when you're first starting a literature review, and students will sometimes just use Google to find information. So I always tell them, avoid this, because the thing with Google is that it pulls up different sources of information, and not all of them are academically valid. Not all of them are academically relevant. So it's only when you become sort of an experienced academic can you discern the difference between academic literature and not so academic literature. So for people who are starting off in terms of trying to source academic or scholarly literature, I would say your first point of departure, and that's what they're there for, is using your library databases. And the reason for this is because usually those databases have only academically relevant literature, and they've also sort of been reviewed and vetted, before they even put on those databases. So if you haven't developed the ability to discern between academic and less academic sources, then your first line of defense is going onto the library databases, because those sources are already academic, of a reasonably high academic quality. So use them. I know a lot of research students also, I'll speak to them and they'll be sort of doing their dissertation for over a year, and they wouldn't have used the library databases. So to me, that's a big red flag because, we put those databases together specifically so that you have the information at your disposal and you don't have to apply your mind too much in terms of thinking, what, is this academically rigorous, or is it not, So important technical considerations when you're using your library database is to ensure your VPN is on, and at UKZN, the VPN is called Global Protect, which I'm sure you all know at this stage. Ensure your VPN is on at all times because sometimes when it's off, you won't be able to access certain articles that you find. So we've all been down that road where we find a really great article that aligns 100% to our study, and then we can't access it. There's no permission to access it, or it says you have to have an institutional account or something to that effect, right? So put the VPN on, and 9 out of 10 times you'll find that you actually do have access to the full article, but you have to log in through your institution. So if you're a bit confused about how to do this, the instructions can be found in the middle of the UKZN library homepage. I've also included the link there to the UKZN library homepage if you've never been to it before. You just click on it and you'll see instructions for activating that VPN or Global Protect. I'll show you a picture of how it looks like in the next slide. You can also access these databases from off campus. So, everybody's working online remotely now. You're not always going to be on campus at all times. So you may need off-campus access. And under the resources tab on the UKZN library homepage, you click on that, and then it will ask you to log in with your UKZN username and password. So once you put that in, you should then have access to all the UKZN library resources. So I've just included a picture here of the library homepage. I've also circled, if you see that top yellow circle is the resources I was referring to in the previous slide. And then when you click on that, it will open that drop-down menu. And at the bottom, you'll see off-campus access. So that's where you click on, and then a box will pop up and you can put in your username and password to be able to access the UKZN library resources from off-campus. And I was talking about the VPN activation instructions. If you scroll to that portion of the library homepage, you'll then see VPN connection written there under help, and then it will say Global Protect Client. So if you click on that, there's an activation guide with the steps that you can follow to activate your VPN. So once you activate your VPN, you have access to a lot more sort of articles, books, book chapters that you wouldn't have had access to without that VPN being activated. So when you're looking for literature, I would suggest to always activate this VPN before you even start looking, because it would be quite frustrating to find a source of information and then you can't really access it, and then you have to go out, come here, and in that process you sort of lose that page. So I would say start with the VPN activation first and then go from there. So for those of you who may not have seen the UKZN library homepage as yet, this is what it looks like. As you can see, it's very simple and straightforward. You have your different resources at the top, and then you also have sort of a search bar where you can search for resources from the library through. So in terms of searching databases, which is what we initially started discussing in the section, I had said that it's best to consult the databases that the library already has, especially if you're confused about what constitutes academic sources of information. So how would you do this? You would go to your library homepage, and at the top there where it says resources in the first yellow circle, you just click on that, and then you will have this drop-down menu where you select databases, and then another menu will open to the right of it, and you can select various options. You can select databases A to Z, which means that these databases are arranged in alphabetical order. You can select databases by subject, which means that it'll be structured according to particular subjects. So I suggest, if you know the subject in which your dissertation or study area sits, I would suggest selecting on this option because you can just very quickly choose the subject. The databases A to Z is very long, so databases by subject usually helps you hone in very quickly to the most relevant database. And then here is just a screenshot of those database searches by subject. So you can see there's agriculture, anthropology, architecture, biological sciences, computer science, development studies. So whatever area your study is in or is going to be in, if you're doing your proposal, you would just find it and click on the subject area, and then it will open up a whole lot of sub areas, you could call them. So here I've given the example of if you click on the management studies database search, it will open up a whole lot of databases, business insights, business source complete via EBSCOhost, global market information database, you have MarketLine, you have the SAE publications via Sabinet, and you have Web of Science. So some you may already be familiar with, some may be new to you, but all very relevant to management studies. And as you can see there with management studies, in the brackets, it says see also multidisciplinary. So what you can do is you can go straight to multidisciplinary and click on it, and you'll find even more databases that may be relevant to a study in management studies. But the nice thing is that you don't have to search for these databases by yourself. It's very difficult for a new research student to be able to the names of all these databases. And so that's why it's helpful to use the library homepage to get to these databases, because you may know one or two. Like I know EBSCOhost is quite popular, and Web of Science, but as you can see, you may not know about Business Insights and SAE publications and all other ones. So it's a nice way to very quickly just hone in to relevant databases to a particular subject area. Now, with the database searches, it's very simple to find those search bars. They're usually at the top of the particular database. Here I have a screenshot of the Sabinet database, which contains African journals. And all you have to do, if you see in the search bar circled with the red circle, is you go in there and you just type particular search words or even the topic of your study, and it will pull out a whole lot of sources of information that you can use in your literature review. The issue then becomes that because there's so much information out there and there's so much information in these databases, you'll often pull up many, many, many sources of information. So you can see here with the example of employee engagement, which is put into the search bar at the top, it's pulled up 63,007 sources of information. Now, what these sources of information are is it's all types. So it'll be journal articles, it will be review articles, it will be book reviews, all types of information. And this number would have probably increased because the search was done some time back. So there's probably way more articles and sources of information in the Sabinet database regarding employee engagement. But you may look at this and feel overwhelmed and think to yourself, how am I going to get through 63,000 sources of information? This is going to take me sort of 10 years. And you'd be very valid in thinking that, because it will take a lot of time, right? So you have to think about focusing your search. And the way in which you can focus your search is using what is known as database limiters. So the purpose of database limiters is it's a tool that you can use to sort of refine or focus your search on only material that is absolutely necessary to your particular literature review or to your quest of sourcing information for your literature review. In the academic space, what is usually required or not required is that you would want to aim for peer-reviewed pieces of information. So what this essentially means is that the information was looked at, it was reviewed by people in the field, and the information and the overall piece of information, whether it was a journal article, book, or book chapter, was reviewed by a subject matter expert, and they've put their stamp on it and said, you know what, this information is valid information, it's reliable, and there is that vetting process before that particular piece of information is published or put into the public domain. So when it's non-peer reviewed, it means that nobody's actually looked at the information in this piece of work, and it can't be really verified. So aim for peer-reviewed sources of information, which means it's been vetted, it's been reviewed, and the reviewers have put their stamp on it and said this is worthy of publication and being used by other authors and researchers. Another thing you want to avoid is dated references. So how this looks in terms of, there'll be some schools or disciplines or departments that will say only use references from the last 10 years. Some schools will say 15 years, and some others will say from the past 5 years. So only use sources of information from the past 5 or 10 or 15 years. And again, you need to consult with your supervisor and ask, you know, what would he or she prefer in terms of when this time limit should be. So to come back to a question that was asked earlier, which is often a gray area in this issue, is, you know, seminal works. Seminal works are works that, you know, were written many, many years ago, but they're key works, and so they're relevant to a particular topic or issue. Those can be included, but as I said earlier, we don't want to have a literature review that has too many of those dated citations or references. So you need to think critically about how can I balance including the seminal author's works with more current works and sort of integrating the two, and also justifying why you have included more dated works. And things like that, you know, don't be shy to say it in your literature review. Don't be shy to say, you know, I've included this piece because even though it's from the 70s, it's a seminal work in this theory. You know, sometimes examiners and reviewers want to see claims like that and to see that you know that including this needs to be justified. So you can very clearly say that in the literature review as well. You want to avoid magazine articles, and also recently I've seen that a lot of students use websites. So I would say for a PhD, try to avoid magazine articles and try to avoid websites as much as possible. Because the rationale here is not that, you know, as academics, we don't like websites, but the rationale is that usually the information on websites and articles is not always verified and is also not of a relevant academic strength to include in an academic dissertation. And, you know, there's no excuse in terms of saying, I know a lot of students will say, oh, well, I couldn't find this information in a journal article or book chapter. But I always tell them, I think you haven't looked hard enough, because the truth is that there's so many journal articles, books, book chapters, and all those other types of literature out there that it's highly unlikely that you will not be able to find that information elsewhere. And the caveat is, like, if you have searched everywhere and you simply cannot find this information in an academic source of information, then you can use, you know, the article or the website. But you must have conducted a very thorough search to ensure that you've looked everywhere and you simply could not find it. The other option is to just omit that information if it's not so important to overall thesis or study topic. So again, apply in your mind to figure out what makes sense to your literature review and to your overall study is very important. And of course, the purpose with the database limiters is that with that 63,000 sources, you're not going to be able to look at every single one of them. So using the database limiters makes your literature review and the search for information much more manageable. And so you should always be using it with whatever search you do on these databases. So it's usually located on the left or right-hand side of your search results. And why I say usually is because with some databases, it's on the left. With some databases, it's on the right-hand side. So you just have to look a bit, but you'll definitely find it. And I'll show you a screenshot of how this looks in the following slides as well. So some technical things you'd want to consider when using database limiters is to always select full text only. And the reason for this is if you don't select this, it will often pull up like abstracts of the paper or summaries of the paper. Now, you shouldn't be aiming to look at the abstract or summary of the paper. You want, that's just the bones of the study. You want the meat of the study. You want to know what this author did, what they found, what were the limitations of their study, what were the strengths. You want all or as much details as possible on that particular topic. So you want the full text article. You shouldn't be reading just abstracts or summaries of articles. Again, something that a lot of research students do to save time, but I wouldn't advise it because, as I said, the real strength and depth and complexity and contribution of something like a journal article or book chapter is not really in the summary. That summarizes it. But the real meat is found in the content of the article or the book chapter. So try to avoid just reading abstracts or summaries only. You'd also want to select references available if that option is there. And the reason for this is that if you find a good paper that is very strongly aligned to your study topic or area, and it has a comprehensive reference list, you can then use the reference list, look at the reference list, and use it to find related material or seminal authors' works. So this is quite a strong tip because if you look at the reference list and you see a particular author's surname being mentioned several times, you can bet on the fact that this person does a lot of work and studies and research in that area. So sometimes you may not know that that is a seminal author in that area, and looking at the reference list gives you that wisdom. And so you can then use that to find more, to find out more about the seminal author, but also to find other studies that they have conducted as well. And it's sort of a snowball effect because then you can look at that seminal author's reference list to see who they referenced and then begin to review the material around that as well. So that's a nice way to also have a literature review that is very academically strong and rigorous because you're not just sort of pulling out sources from the air, you using a particular method to find good papers and to also see, the authors that are included in that paper, what kind of sources did they use as well. You also want to look for things like refereed or scholarly or research articles. So all of these mean, again, that this piece of work has been looked at, it has been reviewed, and there's a bit of robustness and rigor to this piece of information. The period should be recent. So again, I say here, usually what I tell my research students is that they should look for sources of information from the last 10 years. But I know this is very unique to, to a study. It also depends a lot on what your supervisor thinks, so confirm with your supervisor. Some supervisors will say the last 5 years, especially if it's, a topic or area that is constantly changing very rapidly. Then you don't want to have a source of information from 10 years ago when the field is evolving very rapidly. So again, a decision you have to take in terms of the, knowing the context of your study, but also a decision you need to take with or in tandem with your supervisor. And generally, you would want to look at academic journals or journal articles, as they sometimes refer to, and also things like books or book chapters. With my research students, I tell them to focus on these types of information more than anything else. But again, this is also dependent on your supervisor, and this is also dependent and linked to the particular research topic or area that you're looking at, because there could be a research topic or area where not much information is found in academic journals and books or book chapters, and your supervisor can then advise you as to where to find that information. Okay, so remember we're speaking about these database limiters. So these are just some examples, screenshots of examples of what you as the researcher would, manipulate with these database limiters to get more refined results. So these are just examples. Again, you have to apply your mind to your particular study and see which of these are most relevant. Some are fairly obvious, like the language, where you would select only English language articles or sources of information. But there's other things that are a bit more complex, like the year duration that you want to search for. Again, that's something that if you're not quite too sure about, you can discuss with your supervisor before you filter by date. And then, things like if you're looking specifically for research articles, you can select just research articles, because obviously you wouldn't want to focus on things like editorials or book reviews. That's not generally information that you would want to include in the search for information that would go into a literature review. And then another example of maybe keywords you could include could be South Africa, if your study is based on a South African or local context. And then you would just select that, and it would sort of filter out studies related to South Africa specifically. And in just doing that, it reduces the overall number of sources from 63,007 to 869, which is a big difference. 869 is still quite a lot of sources, but you can then refine the search even further than that. But just to show you the power of using these database limiters in terms of reducing a lot of the white noise around searching for information. And then just got a point there at the bottom that in a systematic literature review, which is a particular type of literature review, you would have to document the exact limiters used. So you'd have to document very specifically, these are the limiters I used, these are the types of sources I use, these are the numbers that were pulled up through this database. You would have to be very explicit with that kind of information if you are doing a systematic literature review. So I'm just going to stop there and ask Prof. Kabanda or Prof. Reddy if there's any questions before I move on to the Boolean operators.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Nikita. They're very interesting questions that has come forth. I think the first one was inquiring whether one should use social media or quote from social media or quote relevant voices from the relevant African voices that seem to have something that is credible, just quoting newspapers. And related to that is someone was also asking whether one can also quote sources from newspapers. I think I'm sure you've already covered that. The next question was asking on whether if someone has written an abstract, can you just place it on a chat GPT and get a summary of the entire article or chapter? That one is quite interesting. Then another one was also asking whether you can cite government documents like the budget, monetary policy review. And then related to that is also someone asking whether it's credible to use information available from the World Health Organization website. We could look into those.
Yes, okay. Thanks, Prof. Kabanda. Okay, so for the first question around social media and information from social media, this is not very favorable in academic writing, but the caveat here is what is your topic on? Because I know there's a lot of social science students, they may be looking specifically at social media or something related to it. So obviously then you can't say, oh no, you can't use social media because it's critical and pivotal to that study. Again, we come back to those two golden points, focusing on the context of your study and having a conversation with your supervisor if you're not 100% sure. With newspapers, definitely you can use newspaper articles, but be sure to reference it properly. What I always advise my research students to do, because referencing can be quite tricky, is to have a reference guide, depending on the style of your institution. Either save it on your desktop or even better, print it out and according to each type of source you're including in your literature review, ensure that you are referencing properly, all the commas are in the right place, all the full stops are in the right place, the necessary information is included in text and in the reference list. And I know a lot of research students also use things like EndNote and referencing software. But the danger here is that sometimes these softwares do not pull the full reference or the full information needed for a reference into the software. So essentially, when you hit insert, you may see the full reference in text, for example, Smith 2020. But students don't check what has been pulled into the reference list at the end. And sometimes as supervisors review their work, they find maybe that there's no volume number, there's no issue number, or the title is not written in full, or the journal name is not written in full. So research students have to do their due diligence in the sense of once that they've clicked insert the reference with your referencing software, go back to your reference list immediately and check if every information that is required is in that citation at the end in the reference list. And the only way you can actually do this correctly is to have your referencing guideline printed out or on your desktop, open it and check, are the author's names correctly, surnames correctly formatted? Is the full stops in the correct place? Is the comma in the correct place? Has the year been included? Is the journal name in italics or not in italics? That's the only way you can check that not only has the referencing software pull that reference and all information related to it into your reference list, but also that it's done so correctly. In terms of the question about abstracts and ChatGPT, so this is a bit of a loaded question because, the use of generative AI is it's an evolving concept, an area and concern in academic studies. I would say that again, this is relevant to whatever study topic you are doing and also dependent on the conversation you have with your supervisor. I wouldn't advise leaning 100% on summaries of articles using generative AI such as ChatGPT, simply because what generative AI does sometimes is it will summarize an article based on its understanding, which, as you know, with generative AI is based on what's already in its database. So from my personal experience, when I've tried to look at whether these summaries are good, there's always important information that is missing or information that is put in a way that is not 100% correct. So if you're doing a dissertation, I would say stay away from these summaries of articles using ChatGPT, just because there's many errors in that summary that's eventually produced. And then there's things like, phantom citations where the AI will just add particular citations which have nothing to do with the information produced. There's a lot of red flags in the use of things like ChatGPT to summarize articles. So definitely at PhD level, what I tell my doctoral candidates is rely on yourself and your own critical skills and abilities. Because if you get an examiner, and usually with things like ChatGPT, it's very easy to spot. Especially if you have a lot of experience with it. So if you have an examiner who can pick these things up, they may give you major corrections. You may even fail the dissertation. And do you really want to go that path with things that you can easily do yourself, so you have to weigh those pros and cons. The next question somebody asked was about government documents. Definitely, you can use government documents in your literature review. Again, like the issue with newspapers, just ensure that it is cited and referenced correctly using a referencing guideline. And then the last question, I believe, was on information from the World Health Organization. Again, you can use information from the World Health Organization website or any website, but just ensure that it is referenced correctly, and also that you can't find that information anywhere else. As I said, websites should be sort of a last resort. So a lot of the information on the World Health Organization site is very generic and it can be found elsewhere. But if it's information that you simply cannot find anywhere else and you've searched high and low, then definitely you are able to use information from that or any other website for that matter.
Okay. If you don't mind, there's an interesting question that I think maybe Prof. Reddy can also assist on this one. The attendee asked, what are the common pitfalls in literature review that one must avoid? And I think when you talk of pitfalls, I think your experiences, Dr. Nikita and Prof. Reddy, become important just to guide them on what to avoid, what not to do. But what can come out of my mind right now, even as we add those, I think learning from what they're presenting to us, there are certain things that we've got to avoid. Some of them include, the lack of a clear focus on of what you're researching on the actual problem, or the first question is an important issue that needs to be taken care of. And you also want to avoid being very descriptive rather than analytical, because I think as you were teaching us earlier on, you want people to go further than just describing, but you want them to crystallize, come up with new things, and go up to the apex of Bloom's taxonomy. Poor organization is something that also has to be avoided. Sometimes, I think for some of our students who have seen more of over-reliance on a few sources, which are overly quoted from page to page, the same source throughout the thesis. So one has to try to look at that, and also sometimes you get cases of failure to identify gaps. Those are some of the things that come into my mind, but you're trying to answer this question, what are the pitfalls? Can you help us on that, Dr. Nikita and Prof. Reddy?
Yes, Prof. Kapan. Prof. Reddy, you can go ahead. It's fine.
No, you go ahead first, Nikita.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Reddy. I would say, yeah, very good points made, Prof. Kabanda. And just to add to that is, I think students also have to be very mindful in terms of how they begin the literature review search and be very organized. Because many, many times I have research students who will tell me, oh, I read this really interesting article, but I can't remember it. Or they would have read 50 articles and they're really excited about it, but they haven't developed any systematic way of organizing what they've read, and also, having a summary of each of those things, because it's very easy to forget, over time. So I would say that the golden tip is be very organized even before you start looking for material, as to how you're going to organize it, how you're going to keep it, how you're going to record it, and how you're going to summarize it, so that when you come back to it, you haven't forgotten everything in relation to that reading or article or book chapter. But just to reiterate what you said, what I find to be the common pitfalls is that sort of laundry list of authors where it's literally like one paragraph per what an author says. If you're doing that, and I mean, it's understandable if you're new at writing a literature review, that's the default position. You read and you write a paragraph about what that author said. But what I would advise in terms of that pitfall is, instead of organizing your information according to authors, rather organize it according to themes. You'll see that as you read the literature, there are authors that say the same things, or more or less the same things, and you can group them into a particular theme and write around that theme, using the authors to support that theme, rather than, author A said this, author B said that, author C said that. So again, very much that aspect. And also another important aspect is that criticality. So you talked about Bloom's taxonomy. It really is at PhD level about showing your critical thinking, your evaluation skills, your creativity. What do you bring to the conversation or to the debate around this issue or topic? Examiners want to hear your voice and they want to see that you can make a contribution as a PhD level candidate. But let me just pass the mic over to Prof. Reddy and he can add if he'd like to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nikita. Somebody mentioned the issue of the somebody mentioned the issue of using government publication. You see, if you're doing research on any aspect of the public sector, you got to read the government documents, the official documents. For example, the government the legislation, the policies, and so on, governing all those issues. For example, if you're looking at something topical like corruption, of course, you got to go and see the government thinking on this, the legislation policy that has been introduced in order to curb corruption and so on. So that's quite important. Once again, if you're looking at literature review, it depends on the topic as well. And then you have to decide what you have to go and look at. Now, there is a very positive linkage between the literature review and the supervisor or promoter. For example, if you're looking at, let's say, a supervisor, you know, wanting to promote a certain piece of work on a certain topic, now he or she will have to decide whether they are qualified to do so. In other words, are you au fait with the latest trends and developments in that field? Because most probably, if you take over the supervision there and you're doing your literature review, there's major gaps in the literature in terms of recent trends and developments. And if your supervisor is not clued up on that, then he is going to lose all of that. All right. And then the work goes to the external examiner, who might be an expert on that subject. And he might look at the literature review and he might realize, look, there's a major gap here. Some of the key issues have not been touched upon. And the student might even fail on that basis, or he or she might ask for substantial sort of revisions. So all of these things are important. It also impacts on the supervisor as well as the external examiner. Thanks.
Yes, definitely, Prof. Reddy. Prof. Reddy has made some important considerations there as well. So moving on, beyond using those database limiters, another nifty tool to use in terms of refining your search a bit more is what is known as Boolean operators. I know it's a very funny name, but that's what it's called. And these are just basically using things like quotation marks, asterisks, and a whole lot of other of these tools to refine your search and try to, because with database searches, there's a lot of information. So any language that you can give it to be able to pull out specifically what you need from the database is always helpful. So the first Boolean operator is using quotation marks. The quotation marks you can use around a phrase that you want to be returned in the database in that exact order. So the example I've given here is that of social services. And if you put the social services in your search bar with those quotation marks, then the database will pull out only sources of information, whether that may be articles, book chapters, that are pertaining only to social services. And it will contain that exact phrase of social services. So if you don't use the quotation marks around phrases, what will happen is that the search or database search will actually pull up thousands and thousands and thousands of sources of information, where in the title of that piece of information, social could be anywhere in the title and services could be anywhere in the title. So you're actually pulling up a whole lot of random pieces of information that you don't need. By using the quotation marks, it will only pull out information related to social services in particular. So it could pull things that are as random as, social experiences, services in America, social determinants, and as you can see, that is not relevant to your search for social services in particular. So just a nice way to refine the search a bit more. You can even use the Boolean operator of and this basically narrows the search by giving the database the instruction that all keywords used must be found in an article for it to appear in your results list. So you can actually search for 2 or more terms that interest you by using and combining descriptive keywords. In this example, if you had to use history and photography, then you would pull up sources of information related to history and photography. Another Boolean operator is that of or. So or broadens a search by telling the database that any of the words it connects with are acceptable. And this is especially relevant when you're looking for something that has many words to mean the same thing, or a synonym, sorry. So if you have the examples I've gotten here that we all know quite well is COVID-19. You'll see that some books or sources of information, even journal articles, some of them will have COVID-19, while others will write COVID-19 as coronavirus. But if you're doing a study on COVID-19, coronavirus, you'd want all of those sources of information. So that's where you'd use or, you'd say COVID-19, and then you would put or and coronavirus. And you can see that they've also used the quotation marks because they don't just want COVID, they want COVID-19 specifically and coronavirus specifically. Another common example is that of studies pertaining to universities. So we tend to call them university. In other countries, they may be labeled as tertiary institutions or even vice versa. But you want your search to pull out all pieces of information relating to whether you call it tertiary institution or university. So in that case, you would use the or as well to just make sure that, sometimes if you search for university, there's a whole lot of interesting studies that have used the term of tertiary institute, but you won't find them now because you've just put university in the search bar. And then not narrows your search by telling the database or platform to eliminate or remove all terms that follow it from your search results. So here in the example, we're talking about we want the database to pull out information about communication, but not related to marketing. So in the search bar, you'd write communication and in alphabetical letters, not, and then marketing. Another example is if you are investigating stress, but you don't want studies pertaining to stress amongst teenagers, then you would put stress, not teenagers, and it would then eliminate all studies pertaining to stress and teenagers. And then you may also combine operators. So you can actually use more than one of these Boolean operators in your search. For example, if you're looking for social media and social network, you'd want to use those quotation marks to ensure that those terms are pull information in that particular order. But then you can also use the or because social media and social networks are synonymous. And then maybe you'd want to link it to communication. So then you would put your and in there and you would add your communication at the end. And if that seems too sort of confusing, most databases, they have advanced searches. So you just click on the advanced search bar and then you can put all of these factors into that search bar and it should more or less pull out the same sources of information as you would using the Boolean operators. There's also things known as wildcards and truncations. So with a wildcard, you have things like a question mark. And if you insert the question mark into your search criteria, you can use it to represent a single character. For example, with woman, if you put that question mark after the M and before the N, it will pull out all studies related to either woman as a singular or woman as a plural. So obviously, if you're looking for studies relating to females, you would want those studies, whether they're labeled as woman with the E or woman as a A. And then there's also the asterisk. The asterisk is used to represent 0 or more characters. For example, there we have the plant, and then you have an asterisk next to the plant, and it will pull out all sources of information related to that root. So it will pull out information related to plants and planting, and then there's an example there of anemia. So it will pull out different types of sources of information related to the difference in spelling there of anemia, which is often different amongst countries. And then just some exceptions to remember: the wildcards cannot be used at the start of a search term. So for example, you can't put it at the beginning of tension, or even in terms of tobacco smoke right at the end. It won't work. It will probably produce an error message in the database that you're using. And since this is quite complex information and it's very, hard to remember based on just one presentation alone, I found that most databases do provide help guides. And when you click onto the help guides, they then go into detail about these Boolean operators and how to use it. So definitely for Wiley and EBSCO, I've seen these help guides. You just click on it and it will repeat everything I've told you here and possibly even have more information. The other consideration to add here to this discussion is it's very important to keep up to date with the latest research in your field. So if you recall, we talked about the fact that especially with PhD candidates, you're sometimes doing parts of your dissertation years after other parts, and a lot would have changed in the period between those activities. So you want to find a way to keep up to date with things that are happening in your field, because it's not very practical to be checking databases every day. So many of the library's databases allow you to set up search alerts, and what this basically means is it will help you to keep up to date with the research and published literature in your field, because it will send you emails every time there is new developments in the search results that you have given it. So you can decide whether you want these emails maybe every day, which is quite onerous, because, if you're not actually going and checking these databases every day, I highly doubt you're going to be able to, even if you get an email, go into the database and check as well. But you can select that based on your preference and how much time you have at your disposal. There's also options to choose a weekly email or even a monthly email. So, for example, if you're doing your literature review, actively engaged in it, maybe you can select daily. And then because you're actively doing your literature review, you'd want reminders every day that you can then add to your literature review. But just say you've already finished your chapter and you're analyzing your findings or writing up your discussion, you want to keep abreast of evolutions in your field, but not so often, then maybe choose the weekly or even the monthly option. So for my knowledge, this facility is available on databases such as EBSCOhost, even Scopus, Web of Science, Sabinet, and Google Scholar, which are some of the more popular search databases. You'll be able to find this very easily on them. And the one caveat is that you will have to create accounts on these databases in order to set up alerts. So you definitely have to create an account to have access to the service. And you can also find out more information in how to create these alerts in the databases by going to the help page or help guide in whichever database you want to set up that alert in. I've just included some screenshots here of EBSCOhost, which sometimes it's easy to miss it. But if you look just below the search bar, you'll see something called Create Alert. So usually across databases, you'll see something saying Create Alert, and that means you can create an alert to get reminders of developments in the field. You just click on that, and generally it will open up something that looks like this. And this is where, if you remember, I was talking about curating how often you want to, get emails related to developments in the field. You can select the frequency. You can select the email address you'd like to be to be sent to, and you can even give like a duration of articles published within the last. You can select 1 year, 1 month, etc. So because remember that these articles could have been done some time back, but they've only been put onto the database at that point in time. So you can definitely curate the search for your own specifications. And then again, going back to the UKZN library homepage, is that there's various other ways beyond the ways I showed you about the database search by subject. You can also click onto these various things circled in yellow, and they will take you specifically to things like books and journals, or even take you to Google Scholar. So those are different options of finding information as well. Another option, you may remember that I did a sort of a demo of a search by subject, but you can also search by alphabetical order from A to Z. Just say you can't really find what you're looking for from searching the database by subject. You can always try to look for it in this database in alphabetical order. And this is just a screenshot of the databases that are arranged in alphabetical order. You can see I've just expanded the menu for the ones that are under C. And you can see a whole lot of different databases which are not arranged by subject anymore. Okay, so some additional considerations. I've spoken to a few of these earlier. Use of referencing softwares such as EndNote. I would highly encourage this at PhD level, just because you're going to be consulting tons and tons and tons of sources of information. And it's very hard manually to keep track of all of that. And the nice thing with referencing softwares is that you can actually download and attach the full papers, because especially with PhD writing is you sometimes have to backtrack, go back to a source, or you may want to use it for when you're doing your journal articles for publication. And so it creates sort of a library of all the sources of information you used and also the full papers for future use. The important caveat here is when you're extracting citations, and I've said this before, make sure that the information pulled into that particular software, whether it's EndNote or some other software, is actually the full citation in text and in the reference list. Because I've noticed quite a few times, even with the EndNote, is that it will pull a reference and there'll be missing information in it. And students don't really recognize this because they're not checking each reference as it gets pulled into the MS Word document. So you need to check in text that the author surname is there, the year, and if it's a direct quote, the page number. And especially in the reference list, if all the details are there, for example, the volume, issue numbers, page numbers, correct journal names, things like that, you have to check as you inserting those references into your document, because to try to backtrack again at a later stage is very time consuming, and sometimes that article may not even be available online anymore. And unfortunately, be prepared for technical gremlins. With referencing software, there's always some sort of technical issue that you have to sort of prepare for. Either it will get a bit wonky at the end and not pull through things correctly into your MS Word document, or you'll have sort of glitches here and there. And I'm just saying this because I know a lot of people see software and think, okay, well, this is going to solve all my problems. But with software, there's always some technical issues. But as I said, we live in the information age. So usually when you have a particular issue with the software, you can very quickly sort of Google it, and there is a solution online that you can implement. And then there's always our IT departments here at UKZN that can sometimes assist as well. So the last part of this presentation is about writing up the literature review. You've collected your information, you've analyzed, you've put it into your referencing software, and now you have to sort of write it up. And what this entails is scanning, reading, and evaluating the sources with a specific purpose. So we spoke about that earlier, where it's not just about listing authors one by one, but trying to make a critical contribution in the way you write up that information. As you can see on the left-hand side, the lady there is saying, "I love writing literature reviews," said no one ever. And that's very true. It is a tedious task. It is time-consuming, it's draining, it's frustrating, it's annoying. And if you feel like you don't know what you're doing, you're definitely on the right path. Because you're going to feel like that at many points in writing up your literature review. But just keep going. And again, lean on your supervisor. They will usually point out things like, you haven't been critical enough. This is too much of a laundry list of authors. Your citations are dated. They'll tell you things like that when they're giving you feedback. So sources, as I said earlier, the sources might support your arguments, but they can also reject or contradict your research problem. And I know research students tend to get very anxious, when they have a source that rejects or contradicts what they're trying to do with their study. But I say be open to these possibilities, because it doesn't mean your research topic or area is wrong. It just means that this is an opposing view, and it can be used to strengthen your literature review as well. As you write more and more in terms of writing up the content from your literature review, it will actually have a snowball effect, because you'll identify possible flaws or limitations of your study. And in those instances, again, don't be anxious or afraid. You can use this information to actually strengthen your study. Also, be open to the possibility that while you're writing up this information, it can even point you in new directions and even new methodologies. I spoke about that example before, where I adopted a novel methodology in my study. And a lot of the learnings related to this methodology came through engaging and writing up my literature review as well. And the point that I've made before, so I'm not going to go on too much about here, is that compiling the literature review is also an act that, again, facilitates gap spotting. So you may have identified one gap and based your proposal on it, but as you write up your literature, you can then also identify further gaps, because you're engaging more deeply with the information around a particular area or issue. So again, a point that we've discussed in quite detail: avoid listing authors one after another. And this thing I spoke about, which is, instead of listing authors, try to identify, similarities or differences between the various sources, and then put these into themes that make logical and coherent arguments. So we move away from that laundry list of authors to now have paragraphs relating to a particular theme, and then the authors support those themes or even contest it. And, don't be afraid to contest what these authors say. Again, coming back to that metaphor of being at, having these scholars around the table and you're having a lively debate, you can contest, but also in academic writing, don't focus all of your writing on sort of bashing other authors and saying, oh, well, this work was, it wasn't strong because of this A, B, C, and D, and then you move on to the next work and you pick apart that work. You'd rather show linkages and relationships between the different pieces of information rather than adopt a critical stance of critique in terms of every single author. And in the rare case of, not having enough information on your topic, then, and this is very, very rare, because sometimes students will come to me and think that their topic hasn't been researched enough. And then again, I always tell them, I don't think you've done a thorough search enough, because if you do, and sometimes I assist them with that search, we usually pull up thousands and thousands and thousands of sources of information related to that issue. So it's just that they haven't searched well enough for that topic, for that information rather. And in the very rare case where there's not enough information on a particular topic, then you may have to do primary research and adopt an inductive approach where you generate the knowledge through empirical work. So again, that's something that you discuss with your supervisor. And I would say, again, in most cases, there is information out there. You just haven't used the right avenues and tools to find it. So it can be a long process and time-consuming. With the literature review chapter especially, expect many drafts before the final version. Don't think, once you're done, it's finished. And this point I spoke about is keeping your topic visible when writing. It just helps you to connect what you're writing about in your literature review to your study and to always have that golden thread. And also consider writing about the strengths and weaknesses of research designs utilized. So I know a lot of research students sort of ignored this part of journal articles, especially, is that they don't really write about what designs were utilized. So consider that also a point that you can interrogate and critically analyze as well. An important point which many research students sort of don't include is start your chapter with a brief introduction and also end it with a strong conclusion. And referencing is very, very, very important. And that speaks to that point about having that reference guideline printed out and with you at all times so that you can ensure that you're referencing properly and that there's no sort of errors or anything in the kind of information you have included in text or in the reference list as well. Again, headings and subheadings, we spoke about the funnel approach. You can also, in your literature review, because there's so much of information, you can very clearly state what information you chose not to include. And it's very important to make a well-informed selection of the material available since there's so much out of there. So this is just an author who has very explicitly said that, he's not going to be looking at the literature on drugs and surgery. And at the bottom there, he has explicitly stated what his review will cover. So even if it's as explicit and straightforward as this, definitely include information about what you haven't covered in your literature and even information about what your literature covers in general as well. So these are just key questions, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about them, but they are key questions that you could use when you are writing up your literature review in terms of questions you ask yourself as you're writing up your literature review chapter. Things like, what kind of study was this? Was it an academic study? Was it a non-academic study? Was it an empirical study? Was there field work involved? Those things are important to take note of as well in the literature review. It's not always just about the content of the source of information, but also what type of information is it? Things like, what are the author's aims, their goals? What are the research questions that have guided their study? What are the fields and theories that they have used in their study? What, are these theories explicit or tacit? Because sometimes there'll be a theoretical framework, but it won't be explicitly stated in the article or book chapter, and you have to sort of suss out what this theoretical framework for that particular study is. And also the methods and data. So we've spoken about this earlier. How was that particular piece of information approached? How was a particular study approached? Did the author take a quantitative approach? Did they take a qualitative approach? Have they only analyzed documents or secondary data? Because all of these things can have implications for how you write up your literature review. And as you can see from this slide, it's not things you would automatically think of when writing up a literature review. It's things that, you would probably miss very quickly and say, oh, well, I don't really need to mention whether the study was quantitative or qualitative, but those are important things to note in a literature review as well. And then, of course, the findings. What were the arguments made by the authors? What were the conclusions? What are the implications of this study's findings to your proposed study or the study you've already done? All important considerations. And then the golden thread, always linking it back to your study. What's good about the study? what advantages are there to this particular theory or method that was used for understanding the issue I am investigating now? What are the implications? What are the limitations? What criticisms can I say about this particular author's work or approach? What limitations may be there in terms of how they have approached this particular issue in terms of their method, their data, their theoretical framework, things like that. By answering these questions, you then begin to enhance the criticality of your literature review chapter. And just on a final point here, because I know it's 1 o'clock, just after 1 o'clock already, but I've included here, we spoke about, instead of having that laundry list of authors, you then begin to write around particular themes and use the authors to support those themes. This is an example of that. The first paragraph is an example of talking about the methods, the approach, and the theories that the studies have adopted. And you can see here, as you read through the slide, that the author who wrote this has very specifically moved away from just listing information by author. And now they've listed information in terms of how were these particular approaches by these authors, used in relation to this issue, which is the experience of doctoral writing. And then in that second paragraph and third paragraph, they talk about, in the second paragraph, details accounts of how, qualitative studies basically in relation to doctoral writing, and they interrogate particular issues in relation to this topic. In the last paragraph, the author here speaks about the limitations of these kinds of studies. So you don't have to use this as a template, but I just wanted to add this here so you have sort of a practical understanding of the things I was talking about when I spoke about, not listing all paragraphs by author, trying to write around methods adopted, trying to write around particular themes, also focusing on limitations of studies without bashing authors, all included very nicely and succinctly in this particular slide. So I hope you can take some benefit out of the slide, read it a bit in more detail when you get the presentation, and it very nicely summarizes the kind of information in those highlighted paragraphs to the right of the paragraphs as well. So on that note, I'm just going to stop here. Thank you so much, Prof. Kapanda and Prof. Reddy, for having me. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.